Before we get started with this episode, I have a few requests. Download the Talk Music Talk app. It is free for iPhone and Android, wherever you get your apps, or you can subscribe on iTunes or Google Play. Once you do, just leave a rating and or review in the store to help spread the word about the podcast. Second, share this episode on social media if you enjoy it. Facebook, Twitter, however you like to do it. It will help spread the word about the podcast. And finally, I am in the process of acquiring advertisers and sponsors, and I need your help. Just take a quick survey on my website at talkmusictalk.com/survey. Should take you 30 seconds or less, and it would be greatly appreciated. And now for today's show. Hello there. Welcome to another episode of Talk Music Talk with Boyce. I am Boyce. I am your podcasting host. Talk Music Talk is a weekly music interview podcast where I have long-form conversations with people who are connected to music from different genres, different backgrounds, musicians, singers, songwriters, music therapists, and music journalists. And on episode 110, I had the pleasure of speaking to Brandon Stosuy. Brandon is the editor-in-chief of the online site, The Creative Independent, which is a new project from Kickstarter. It features interviews with creatives, including dancers, filmmakers, and of course, musicians like Bjork and Philip Glass and Anoni, who we talk about in this conversation. Well, two conversations I will explain shortly. Brandon has written for Stereogum, Pitchfork, has also been an editor at those music sites. He's also written for The Village Voice. He is an author. In 2006, he had a book called Up Is Up, But So Is Down, which was about the New York literary scene from 74 to 92. His most recent book is called Music Is, which came out this year. It is a children's board book with illustrator Amy Martin. He's also a music curator for MOMA PS1 here in New York and also at LA's Broad Museum. He's a curator for the Basilica Soundscape Festival in Hudson, New York. And as I mentioned, there are two separate conversations. The first time I talked to Brandon, the conversation leaned more on his professional life, writing and technique, and we also talked about the Creative Independent in detail. But afterwards, I realized I wanted to know more about him and his journey, so I went back to the Kickstarter office and did another conversation with him that focuses more on the personal. Brandon's life is a great example of perseverance and how somebody from a working class family in southern New Jersey with a population town of 800 people ends up heading a Kickstarter project. It was definitely a long path for him that included dead-end jobs and not always knowing the direction that he was going in, but somehow music was always there, whether it was in the forefront or somewhere off in the shadows. There is some overlap with the conversations, not too much, but Brandon is fascinating and interesting, and he definitely can fill two conversations. And on top of that, just a really nice guy. I know you're going to enjoy them. Here they are, two interviews from Brandon Stosuy here on Talk Music Talk. Enjoy. You know, you worked at a record store in college, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So did I, and it was the most prize coveted
what was
job you could have. It was National Record Mart, which was a Pittsburgh chain.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I was in New Jersey, so I worked in a place called Cheap Thrills in New Brunswick.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think it was definitely like a prize job to have because it was a small independent record store. It's since closed down. Basically, after I left, Ed, the guy that owned it, kind of moved it into a smaller space, and then after that, it kind of just moved into no space and just kind of disappeared, as a lot of those things do. But when I was there, it was a great experience. Like we would, it was still a time when people would buy records, and so we'd have a lot of regulars, and we kind of mixed used vinyl and used CDs with new stuff. So we'd have the new indie rock releases, but also just a bunch of old like Pink Floyd vinyl, and we would also often have a lot of like bootlegs. Like there was a guy that would come in and sell like Grateful Dead bootlegs and that kind of stuff. Yeah, we had the
bootleg guy.
And then like there'd be raids going on, and we'd kind of get nervous about the bootlegs. And like, all right, let's move them to the back. And we sold tickets. There was a Ticketmaster there.
Yeah.
So there was often, people would come and wait in line for tickets. And again, like the Grateful Dead people were just hilarious because they would bring boom boxes and like kind of dance as they're waiting in line. And I remember that time too, it was around the grunge era. And so we would sell a Pearl Jam record, and it would be one of those things where it was allowed to go on sale at midnight. And so people would line up at like, for 11 p.m. onward and wait in line. Then we would just like sell them the records. And then by the end, we'd be sold out of the record, which I think now is more of like they'll have like a premiere stream or something, the way that shifted. But yeah, it was definitely like an active culture around the store, and people just come in and ask questions. And it was also a chance to kind of help people. Like someone would come in and say they wouldn't know how to pronounce a band name because they'd never really met anyone else that knew that band. Like I remember a kid coming in asking for a Fugazi album, and he pronounced it, like Fugazi or something. So I like very quietly was like, oh, the Fugazi records are there. Like, so like correcting without making him feel bad kind of thing. And that was where people just come and ask for our recommendations. And we had our little board of like, these are the records we're listening to this week, and this is that. But yeah, it was great. I really enjoyed that. It was just during my college years. And then when I got out of college, I ended up working at Borders because Borders had healthcare, and it was like slightly more than the record store pay wise. I remember sort of having to tell Ed that I was going to go get a job at Borders. And right before I was about to, it was so heartbreak. And it was almost like he could sense it, because like a few days before, like as I was working at the nerve to tell him, he was just like, Brandon, I always think of you as a son. And I'm like, oh man. So this will hold me back for another few days. So I kind of couldn't say it. Yeah. Then he understood. It was like one of those things, the fact that Borders did have healthcare was just like a major difference, that was further away and whatever. But yeah, I tried to do both for a while and I couldn't. And
were you the specialty guy in anything?
Not really. In the record store, no. It was like we had people who were buyers and stuff, and I didn't do that. I was just kind of worked the register, and we put on events. So we'd have like in-store events, and I ran those. Like we'd have like, a noise band would come in and play, or like it was a big store, but there wasn't a lot of space for bands to play. So they were always kind of more stripped down kind of things. So I would do that kind of stuff. But yeah, because I was in school the whole time, there were other people there who were out of school and were working full time. And I was there, when I was there maybe like 3 days a week or whatever, 4 days a week when I was not in class. It's one of those weird things where I was in school and I was doing that, but I was also the editor of the school newspaper. So I was kind of, at nighttime, I'd be there editing the paper for, I think we only had the music section once a week. So we were kind of like, every week we'd have like to get to the deadline for that. So it was like kind of doing that job and then the record store job and then going to class too. And then working at the radio station. So it was just a lot of, just juggling a lot of things at once.
And you were going to school for what?
I went to school, I double majored in English and journalism.
Okay. And where was this at?
This was at Rutgers in New Brunswick.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think that for me, like the English was much more useful. Like the journalism was kind of more like if you wanted to be a newspaper journalist, so it was very much like learning, AP style. And they'd offer you these like moral dilemma questions. Like if you saw like a monk who had immolated themselves, would you try to put out the fire, or would you like write about the story? And I was always like, I'd put out the fire. And then you realize like you're not actually, that's like not what you're supposed to do. As a journalist, you got to just like stand there. Like, So I kind of didn't pass the moral bankruptcy part of it. And so then I was just more interested in the English stuff. And I was always doing zines on the side with my friends, and we were like putting shows on in our house and stuff. Like that to me felt like the most important education, honestly. It was like doing the English stuff because it exposed me to a lot of writers I hadn't heard of. That's like how I learned about like Thomas Pynchon, and then I got really into like postmodern writing because of that, and learned about like Nabokov and just like all these different writers through those classes, and kind of gave me things to kind of explore. But with my friends, like we ran 2 record labels. Like my friend Mark and I had a label called Sweet Babu, and it was a noise label, so we thought it was like funny to have kind of like a sort of Charlie Brown referencing name. And then I had like a more pop label with my friend Mark that was called Jiffy Boy. And then my zine was called White Bread. So I did a zine, and we put shows on. And I think through doing the zine really taught me how to write, but also taught me how to like deal with distribution. Like Tower Records used to distribute it, so I'd have to like mail them out copies. And then I had people would order it via the mail, so we'd always be going down to the post office. Like me and both 2 different marks. I ran labels with 2 different marks. So like the 3 of us would just go down and just like be mailing CDs and mailing records. It kind of almost, taught us to kind of run a business in a way, even though we were like 19 or 20 or whatever we were. In retrospect, at the time you feel very old. Then in retrospect, like, wow, we were like kids doing all this, which is kind of amazing that we were doing that. Yeah. But at the time it just felt like, well, this is what we're going to do. And I think for a lot of us too, we'd come from I came from a small town, and so New Brunswick felt like being in a city to me. And like my grandparents lived in Brooklyn, but I was always just visiting there. Like I was never there all the time. So to actually live in a place like that felt like a big deal to me, and it was close enough to New York City that my friend Adam had a car and we could come up here or we'd often go to Hoboken to Maxwell's and see shows at Maxwell's, but also just come in to see shows at CBGB's or like Brownies or any of these venues that don't exist anymore.
Were you thinking of, when you went to school for English and journalism, were you thinking just writing, but you weren't sure what direction?
Yeah, I mean, basically, I knew I liked doing the zine. Like that was really like a thing. I was like, all right, I like doing this. I liked writing about music. And then my zine became less and less about music and became more just like writing personal stuff about like life and like, you know, the wit and wisdom of like a 19-year-old. So sort of like a lot of it now when I look at it, I cringe, like, cause I've dug them up out of my basement and I'm like, oof. But, you know, at the time it became that. So I think I learned how, like the music stuff, the school paper kind of made me think, all right, I want to write about music too. But I was doing it in very much the way of like a 19-year-old where I was doing like experimental record reviews and all that kind of stuff. It's like, again, pretty bad.
Pension record reviews.
I also had the problem of like, I became the editor of that section as a freshman. So I was like really young, and it was because the guy who ran it was graduating, and I basically had written like 3 reviews. And he saw some kind of like potential in me. And so he pulled me aside and was like, I'm graduating next semester. Like, would you want to take over? And he gave me a Lester Bangs book. And so I'd never heard of Lester Bangs. So I read it. And that was like one of those things where like, you know, like a lot of young people who are writers will read Raymond Carver and be like, oh yeah, I can write like this. And they'll try to do it. It's not good. And so like my thing was I read the Lester Bangs. I was like, I'm going to become like this guy. So I was like writing things like that were just like horrible. But then I think, as I did more of it, I kind of like found my own voice and got better at it. And I think it was useful to like have that, just to be dealing with deadlines and all that. So I think I kind of figured out more and more what I wanted to be as I was there. I knew I wanted to be doing stuff with music in some way, and I wanted to put on events, like, you know, we did shows in the basement, and I wanted to be active in that scene, but I wasn't entirely sure what I wanted to do. And I think I also at that age was very like punk rock, and so I was a little bit like wary of taking a job at the wrong place. Like I didn't want to get locked into something. And I mean, I basically, when I graduated from Rutgers, which was like 95, I'd met this woman through my zine, in fact, and she was Canadian. And so then like I moved to Portland for a while with this idea of like, I'm going to be a writer and I won't know anyone. And I'll just like live this like very pure life. So like I went out to...
Why Portland?
I'd had a band in college and we toured. Like we booked our own little tour and we just played a bunch of like small DIY spaces. And when we were in Portland, I thought it was really beautiful. And like, there's, you know, the big mountain in the middle of the town, and it felt inexpensive at the time. I think it was inexpensive. And I also met a few people there, like in this band, The New Bad Things. And, there's this label like Chainsaw Records out there that had like Team Dresch and people. There was like, so I knew a few people that I could go there and kind of, and my friend Eric, who's in the band Noggin, lived there as well. And so he basically was like, yeah, if you come out here, you can live with my wife and I for a while till you get your feet under, you know, you get ready to go. And I basically, I lived in their closet. They had like a really big closet. And that's where I would sleep, and I would spend the days like working. There was a Borders there. So I could like transfer from one border to the other. So I transferred into the other Borders, and it was like, the thing is about Portland is they have a huge bookstore there called Powell's, you know? Everyone goes to Powell's. No one goes to the Borders. So the job was really easy.
You didn't know that.
Yeah, I didn't know that. But it was like really easy. So I would just kind of be there, and like the people, like my manager was the guy in this band Bug Skull that I had always really loved. And it was like a lot of, like people in their like 20s who were just kind of there hanging out. And just the guy that he would like encourage us to be like, if you like a book, just like take it home and read it. Just like bring it back without damaging it, like that kind of thing. So it was almost like working in a library or something. I was in charge of like the political science section. So I'd make these like Noam Chomsky displays and like all that. And while I was there, this woman that I had met through my zine, like came to hang out, and she was Canadian, and it was like pre 9/11. It was like a period where you could actually just like go into Canada. And so I decided, you know what, like, Portland's okay, but it rained a lot. And I was much more used to the East Coast, and like the pace of Portland was really slow, and it just felt like I didn't really quite jibe with it. So like after 6 months, I was just like packed my stuff into a van, and I had very little. Like when I moved to Portland, I had this idea of like less is more kind of thing. So I didn't have a bed. I had a sleeping bag. I made a desk out of the milk crates.
Okay.
And I brought books. And like my friend Eric, who's in that band Noggin, who let me sleep in his closet for a while, like after I got my own place, he worked for Odwalla Juice, and he would bring me all like the day-old juice. So I was kind of subsisting on like juice. It was just like so minimal. And then I moved to Canada.
Like a fast.
I don't even know what a fast was at the time. It was like I kind of did a fast without realizing it. And I remember I'd eat pretzels too. Like I was always eating pretzels because I was vegan at the time, so it was just like a mess. But so when I met this woman, I was like, I'm just going to go to Canada. Why not? I'm like 22 or whatever. And so I packed my stuff into my van. I had a van at the time, and I had a cat at the time. And so we just went to the border in Vancouver, and they're like, where are you going? And I said, I'm going to go visit a friend. I had all this stuff with me, and they were just like, all right. They let me through. Yeah. And I think it was
honest.
I think it was partially because a snowstorm was coming and things. Okay. So they were just kind of like, all right, let's get this guy through. But yeah, so then I drove through. My brother came with me, actually. Like he flew out, met me in Portland, and the two of us went through together. Then we drove across from Vancouver into Alberta, where she lives. So yeah, then I lived in Canada for a few years and managed to like apply for permanent residence and get it. I don't have it anymore. Like you lose it once you leave. But when I was in Canada, I worked at a gas station. Like initially, that was like it was a graveyard shift at a gas station, which for me was great because I could just read all night because there was like a certain period of time where people wouldn't come in. And so I would just like stock the milk. It was like a gas station that had like a convenience store section and all that. It was a Shell gas station. So I had to wear like a Shell uniform, and I would kind of like go in there and get the milk stocked, mop. And then, around 3, some people would come in who were done like being at the bars, and then they would all kind of leave. And then I'd have again, like just a few hours just to sit there and read and stuff. And then I worked in a garden center, like a greenhouse, which I know nothing about plants. So I was always just kind of like, oh, you should talk to this person. They're the ones that know a lot about like composting or whatever. And I was just, I don't even know how I got that job. It was like, it kind of came up, and it was not a graveyard shift job. So I was like, maybe this will be better.
Were you doing both at the same time?
I had a short overlap where I did both. And because the woman that I was dating, she was in college, and she didn't have a lot of money, and I couldn't work for a while. So when I first got there, I was just pawning all my stuff. So I'd go to like the pawn shop. I had an old like Moog keyboard that my friend had given me, and I sold that. Oh, really? I sold my guitar. I just like selling everything just to stay there, because I was like, all right, I'm young, and I would just like go to the library all day and just read before I got a job. Then I eventually got those jobs once the paperwork went through. Then I lucked out where there was a gallery in town called the Southern Alberta Art Gallery, which was a really good gallery and had a lot of sort of experimental, strange contemporary art, because they had a lot of funding from the Canadian government. So they'd make these amazing catalogs. And so people would go to the gallery, and like people wanted to have shows there, different artists, like international artists, because even if a lot of people weren't coming to the shows, they'd get an amazing catalog out of it, which in the end was kind of more important, because then you had this thing like that you could have for the rest of time and be like, yeah, here's I ended up going there all the time, and they had an opening for like a gallery assistant, and I applied for it, and I got it. And so then I suddenly had like, again, like how the record store job was kind of like the coveted job. I got this kind of job that was kind of the coveted job. And I remember there was like some young artists who were kind of annoyed because I wasn't an artist. I was just some dude who'd come, and I was American as well. So they're just like, oh God, this guy got the job. But then as I was there, I just kept sort of expanding my role and doing more stuff. And then the woman who was the head preparator, this woman, Pat, she had like space in her house. So then like my girlfriend and I like moved in above her. And so it sort of became this like really nice situation where like I could walk to the gallery. I got to learn a lot about like installing art and stuff. And Pat was scared of heights. So whenever there was like an installation that involved like a ladder, I would do it. But yeah, like they had art auctions, and I would sort of help out with those. And like I'd be the guy that like carried the art with the white gloves on and stuff.
During this period, did you have any idea what you wanted to do, or you just sort of like...
I was floating a little bit, but I was also writing for, in Alberta, in Calgary, there was like a free weekly publication. I did a couple reviews for them. So I was still doing writing. It was kind of a weird period for me though, because I sort of like checked out of music in some ways. Like I only listened to Leonard Cohen and Smog, I remember, and like I just kind of didn't really, it was like 1997, and I feel like whenever people talk about that year in music, I'm always like, like that was kind of a year that I didn't really pay much attention. And then
what was that?
I think I didn't have any money, and also like, and it was before really like there was computers, but I feel like it wasn't like a lot of the online streaming stuff wasn't there yet. And so I just kind of, and there wasn't really a good record store in Lethbridge. Like there was like basically like like a Virgin Records or like something with like a small, or like it was called HMV. It was an HMV. Yeah. So I would kind of just go to there. And if you wanted anything of interest, like I remember my girlfriend at the time was into Belle and Sebastian, and we'd have to like special order them. You know what I mean? And then like they'd come in like 3 months later. Like, all right. So it was like just such a clunky system. So I just kind of stuck to my records that I had and didn't really, and I kept a lot of them just like in storage or whatever, and didn't really, I mean, like in boxes, not really in storage, but yeah. And so, and then I think what happened was I was just doing so much reading when I was there that I kind of thought I should go to grad school and like do something, because I started just systematically reading, like, I'm going to read all of Flaubert. I'm going to read all of Ibsen, just reading all these weird, like, old man books, basically, like as like a 20 something. And so then
was there something you were looking for?
I was trying to figure out, I was trying to I wanted to be a writer at the time, like to write fiction is what I kind of more and more thought. And so I was kind of trying to just learn as much as I could. Like I basically felt like when I graduated college, university, I didn't know that much. Like I felt like I had read the books in school, but there was a lot I'd missed because when I was younger, I grew up in like a small town without parents who necessarily were into books. And so I didn't have, you often will talk to people like, yeah, my dad's was into the Velvet Underground and stuff. And like my parents were like working class people who were just kind of like working, and they weren't saying, yeah, you should go read this or read that. So I kind of felt like I had a lot of catching up to do. And so when I was in Canada, I just started doing that. And as I just got more and more excited about all these things I was discovering. So then I felt like, wow, now I actually feel ready to go to school. And I'd been friends with this woman, Kate, who worked with me at Borders, who was like, much older than, not much older, but like when I was in my 20s, she was like in her 40s probably. But it's like one of those things when you're in your 20s, you can't really tell how old the person is. Yeah. And she was like, you should go try like University of Buffalo. Because I was really into the writer Samuel Delany, and he was teaching there. And also I got really into like psychoanalysis stuff, and they had like a center for Lacanian thought there. So she suggested it to me, and I looked into it. And I was like, yeah, this seems like an interesting place. So I applied to go there, and then I got in. And so then me and this woman moved back, like we moved to Buffalo and went there. And it was there that I kind of got back into music really intensely. And Tony Conrad was one of my professors there, like the minimalist composer. And we ended up becoming friends and like making music together. And I started putting on tons of events because Buffalo was like a very cheap place to live. And at that point, because I was in grad school and I was teaching undergrads, I had like my tuition was free, and I had like, I actually had money for like sort of not a lot, but enough to kind of like do things. And so then it became a little bit easier to kind of get by in that way. And I started writing a lot more again, and just becoming more engaged. Like, when I was in Canada, I did make a film, like a short film, but it was based on all my writing I was doing. And I had met a bunch of people there who knew how to make a film, and they helped me make it. And like we ended up getting a grant from like the Alberta Foundation for the Arts to make it and stuff. So I was still doing creative things, but it was a kind of a period where I just felt like I was reading a lot and trying to learn a lot. And then when I went to Buffalo, I was able to kind of put all that learning into use, which was cool. And I did my grad work on this writer, Dennis Cooper. And so I'd organized a conference for like a bunch of writers in his zone when I was there, who all came out from like San Francisco in the Bay Area. And, at that point, I was just doing more fiction writing and more music writing. And I started writing for, Pitchfork when I was there. It's like, and I basically, like, a friend of mine was suggesting like places I should try freelancing for. Cause there was a thing where like, I'd always wanted to write for the Village Voice, which I ultimately did. But when I was there in Buffalo, I was like, hey, I want to write for you guys. And then one of the editors there, Jessica Winter, who I'm now friends with, she was like, yeah, we usually start people off with the Sound of the City section, but you have to kind of review shows in New York City. And I was like, yeah, I'm in Buffalo. So it's kind of like I couldn't do it, but at least like put me in the map. And then she ended up forwarding me eventually to Chuck Eddy, and then I ended up doing writing for him. And that wasn't until I came to New York. But so it's sort of like while I was in Buffalo, I started reaching out to people. I started doing stuff for Pitchfork, started kind of figuring out more like, all right, I'm going to try to like do music stuff. And I still wanted to write fiction, but it was kind of like the music stuff actually paid, and the fiction stuff was like a longer process and didn't.
What would your fiction stuff look like?
It was like, back then it was insane. Like it was kind of very much like I was writing a story where there was like a character who was trying to like write compositions like based on cloud formations and stuff. It was like very like meta fiction kind of things. And then I kind of learned that's not what I was good at, and I kind of kept stripping back my writing, and then my writing ultimately became much more like unadorned and like declarative and basic, and I think that's really what it became at its strongest. I mean, I think my writing actually became the best it ever became when I had children, because I had so little time. And so it's like one of those things where, like, when you have all the time in the world as a teenager, you're like, I'm going to labor over this sentence for 5 days. But when you suddenly don't have time, you're forced to just like think. So I think it was like a mixture of being older and wiser, but also like just being forced to really like distill things down. That really helped my writing. But also just writing for Pitchfork for years. I mean, I've written like hundreds of reviews for them at this point. Just kind of writing that much, you can't help but get better. And then having good editors like Ed Park at the Village Voice was a great editor for me. And like I wrote about books for him, and he would really just make my stuff sound better, but also just kind of show me what he was shifting. And I was like, yeah, you're right. And he kind of learned about that through him. And Elizabeth Vincentelli, who was my editor at Time Out New York, like she kind of taught me a lot about what I was doing right and wrong with my writing. So I just kind of, when I moved to New York after grad school, I just started writing for a bunch of publications. And I was working at NYU a couple of days a week in the rare books room, like archiving Dennis Cooper's work, who I'd done my grad stuff on. And it just kind of was this like slog of like always juggling a bunch of jobs for most of my life. And so I would work there. I would be trying to like get freelance stuff done and then working there. And then I eventually, like, when I was in Buffalo, I had worked at the rare books room there as well. But we were doing this, oddly enough, like a CD-ROM about Huckleberry Finn that never got made. So we were like working on that. And then, but through that connection, this guy, Robert Berthoff, when I moved to New York, he put me in touch with this woman, Odysseus Scores, who was like an art dealer. And Robert Berthoff was like the expert on this poet, Robert Duncan, and she owned all the artwork by Robert Duncan's partner, Jess. And so she asked me if I would want to archive a lot of Jess's work. So I started working for her, and she was paying me under the table and paying me way more than NYU was. So that allowed me to like really like, all right, I worked for her 2 days a week, then I could just write the other days. And then as my writing jobs picked up more and more and more, I was eventually able to sort of say, okay, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm just going to do writing full time. So, but it was like a slow process, and it really only happened when I'd gone to cover a music festival in Norway for Pitchfork. At the time, Pitchfork still was not paying a lot, and they didn't really have many full-time writers. It was just like a small operation. But I met this guy, Amrit, who worked at Stereogum, and they had just been bought or just been invested in by the Pilot Group. So they had money all of a sudden. And we really got along while we were in Norway, and we kind of hung out. And then when I got back to the States, we were out at CMJ, and I saw him, and he introduced me to this guy, Scott, who had started that site. And Amrit was like, yeah, this is the guy I was telling you about. He's been working at Pitchfork. And then they basically, like a few weeks later, offered me a job, which was like a salary and healthcare and all this stuff. So I was like, bye, Pitchfork. And I went there because it was actually like a sustainable thing that I was able to like quit the art dealer thing full time, and I could just focus on writing. And I stopped writing for other places. It was suddenly like, for really the first time in my life, I had like one job. So I was like, cool, this is like this one thing.
Did that look like a shift in your life finally?
Yeah, that felt like a big moment. Yeah, because suddenly I was like, wow, I'm actually getting paid to be a writer full time now. Because there's a lot of people who write, like a lot of Pitchfork's writers are freelancers who have day jobs and they write at night or like they write when they can. And so this felt like, wow, I'm actually getting paid to just do nothing but write. So that felt like a big thing for me. It's like something that, like just growing up where I grew up and like my dynamic in my family, I never thought that I would be a writer full time. So it's one of those things that now when I talk to my dad, he's like, yeah, I always knew you'd be a writer. And I'm like, yeah, I don't think so. Because it was, and I don't blame him, but he was definitely much more like pushing me and like, well, maybe you should try to do like this more practical thing. And so I think I always knew I wanted to be a writer. I just wasn't sure what kind of writer I wanted to be. And then,
so were you an outlier in your family or your
to a degree, my
neighborhood environment?
Yeah, I'm definitely in my neighborhood. Yeah, like my town had 800 people, and it was like very.
Where are you from?
Southern New Jersey. It's a town called Chatsworth in the Pine Barrens. It's like very small, like weird right wing farming community, you know. So, and I was into like punk rock and had like, I had friends who were like gay and I had friends who were black, and it's like there's just like in my town that was just like like this guy's weird. Like, what's he trying to do here? You know. So I think, but my younger brother, we kind of became like we were still really close, and I think part of that was because we both were very much like we got to get out of this place, and so we kind of teamed up together. And I have an older sister who's great, but she was much more able to be like, I'm in New Jersey. Like, I love hair metal, and I'm just going to like, I'm going to live this life. And cool. And she was like a liberal person, but she was just kind of like fine with being, and we were just like, we got to get out of this place. So my brother lives in Santa Cruz now, and I'm here in Brooklyn, but it's like, we definitely was, my mother, she was married like 4 times, and like some of my stepfathers were like total characters, just like these like weird hunting dudes who, when I did my zine, the reason my zine was called White Bread was it was kind of like documenting growing up in a white trash town, like trying to escape it. And a lot of my material was just like writing about these stepfathers because they were just such characters and just such weird people that I would suddenly be like forced to live with a guy who was like kind of an amateur taxidermist. So he would like go hunting and try to like do taxidermy of the animals, but he wasn't very good at it. So we'd have all these vats of like weird animal parts in our house. We're like, it's dark.
So how do you see a way out of that when everything around you is not that?
Right.
What you envision for yourself?
For me, it was like, really was music, like punk rock and stuff. Like I had a friend, Moss, who I'm still friends with. We've been friends since first grade. And he had an older sister who was into cool music. And so through her, we learned about like 7 Seconds and the Dead Kennedys and Minor Threat and stuff. And that kind of gave us the realization, there's something out there that we can get into. And we would convince our parents to like drive us to the high speed line. Then we'd take that into Philadelphia. And we'd go to all these record stores in Philadelphia and buy records. Or we'd go to like hardcore shows. We'd go to shows in people's backyards. And we kind of like, none of them happened in my town or his town. We like find places and we would just kind of get our parents to get us there. And we sort of do that. I think through the zine too, because you started corresponding with just tons of people all over the place. So suddenly I had like friends that I was, pen pals, because at the time it wasn't email. We were like, we'd write each other these like letters and like say, here's what I'm listening to, or we'd like trade cassettes, or we'd like trade our zines. And so suddenly I would have like friends in Los Angeles, or friends, in New York, or friends in Europe, or friends in South America. It became this whole like network of people. And a lot of those people I'm still friends with. And like when I was 18, kind of like the like sort of the moment of me really being like, this is my thing I want to do to get out of here, is I put on like a 2-day festival at my dad's house, my dad's farm. He let me do it, which in retrospect, I'm like shocked he let me do it, because there's like just the amount of like things that could have gone wrong, or he could have been arrested for, or whatever, if kids got drunk. But so there was no alcohol. Like he tried to really like, but yeah, I did a 2-day festival, like 400 people came, raised like $7,000. And it was crazy. And
how many bands were there?
It was way too many. It was like 12 a day or something, because like I was young and was just like excited, and I booked way too much. And like, as it happened, I was just like, oof, like I overdid it, but it was fun. And like this one guy, Bill Walton, I'm still friends with, he lives in LA now, but I met him through that because he saw a flyer I'd put up when I went into one of my trips to Philadelphia. And it was so like, it's so funny because it was such an innocent time where no one had cell phones. And so on the phone, it's like for information, call. And it was my dad's house number. So he called that number and he was like, do you mind if I make copies and like post-its around Philly? And I was like, no, do it. So he did that. And then the Princeton radio station PRB picked up on it. They started like talking about it. So it became like this thing. And I think that it felt cool to have all this stuff come to my town and just to see people that were kind of like me in like the weird local Wawa and stuff. And I was like, wow, this feels weird. But also it kind of showed me, hey, I could pull this thing off like now. And that was right at the start of college. And it was like, okay, now I think maybe it was like in my first year of college, like the summer after that, like I wasn't living at home anymore, but like I knew this was the space that I could actually get away with putting on a show that big. And then, went back to college after that and just kept on like working towards that. Like once I moved out for college, I never moved back home again. So it was just kind of like.
Was there ever a fear of, I might have to go back?
If there ever was a fear, it was like more of a financial one. Like, am I suddenly going to like not have the money to pay rent or something? But I definitely like whenever I lived in houses in New Brunswick, it would be like me and like 9 other people. Like, it was definitely like we stuffed so many people in there, and our rent was so cheap because of that we could kind of get by. And because I had like always had a steady job, there was like some kind of way to like pay the rent. So I think like once I was out, I was like, all right, I'm done. And then, so for me, it was like from a very young age, I just kind of thought it's beautiful here. Like there's lots of trees. It's nice, but it always felt weird to me. Like it never felt like home. And I even have this now, like if I go somewhere and even if it's like a beautiful place, like if I do go to Los Angeles a lot over the summer because I was doing stuff for a museum out there, and it's like, I'd go there and I'd have fun. But the second I got back to New York, I was like, all right, this is like where I should be. And like same thing with Portland. Like I was like, all right, this is beautiful, but it just feels like something's missing. And I'd always kind of felt like that until I came back here. So kind of being here, having a full-time writing job, and I was like, all right, cool. Now I've this is like it's set now.
Yeah.
And then basically like what happened with the Stereogum thing is I worked with this woman, Jessica Suarez, and she and I were like really good friends. We're still friends. And like she was leaving to go to MTV, and I was walking back from her going away party, and I got a call from Mark Richardson, who was like the editor-in-chief of Pitchfork.
Yeah.
And he was like, hey, would you want to come back? Like we have we have a job. I was like, yes. Because like the thing was like I liked Stereogum, but I'm not really a blogger. And at Stereogum, my job was like writing like 12 posts a day or something. It was like really, it almost felt like, my first job was picking blueberries when I was a kid. It kind of felt like picking blueberries because it was just this like nonstop, like get one done, get one done, get one done. Yeah, with blueberries, you get paid by how much you pick. It's not hourly. So you're just like, you can't stop or else like you're not going to get any money. So it kind of felt the same way. So once I could like get out of there, and then I went to Pitchfork, and my job was like editing reviews, writing a couple reviews a week, working on features. I had a column. So kind of really felt like, all right, cool. Now I'm like where I wanted to be initially, but like when I initially tried to get a full-time job at Pitchfork, there just wasn't the money to do it. So that felt really like cool. Now I'm like in this spot where everything is kind of paid off. Yeah. So I mean, it was definitely a long thing. And I always have this thing where like interns or students, like I taught at NYU for a couple semesters in the art department, and like they'll always ask like, all right, how do I do what you do? Or like, and I always explain like it's a really long process. So I'm like, there'll be people who are like 22 and they're just like, yeah, I feel like I'm behind. And I'm like, do you realize when I was 24, I worked the graveyard shift at a gas station? Like it's definitely not like you had overnight success. Like it takes a long time. And I think in this day and age, because people learn more and more, like they kind of get street smart faster in a way, or like internet smart. They kind of learn about like, all right, I'm going to pitch stuff to like Rolling Stone when I'm 14. Or like they kind of, where that never would have dawned on me as a kid. Like I just didn't really think that was possible. So I think a lot of people, because they kind of know what they want to do earlier or think they know, they expect to have the results faster. And so like they kind of feel like if they haven't made it by the time they're 25, they've kind of like failed. And I'm just like, like I didn't, I don't think the Pitchfork thing, I was probably like, got like early 30s when I started working there full time. So it's like not something that was just an immediate thing. And even now, like now that I'm here, I'm like editor-in-chief of my site, and I feel like this is the best job I've had. I'm like really doing something that I really care about. There's always a part in the back of your head where you're like, oh no, what happens? Like suddenly you're like, but yeah, I think at this point I feel like now that I'm 42 and I've been at it a long time, it's like, cool. Like I'm where I want to be. And I was able to actually like walk away from Pitchfork, because I didn't like the direction it was going in. And I was like, all right, cool. This thing came up and I wanted to do this instead. So I feel like that was a moment where what I thought was my dream job, suddenly I was like, I don't want this anymore. I want to like do something that feels more pure and kind of like goes back in a weird way. Like it almost like circles all the way back to like the zines I was making as a kid, where you can just kind of write from the heart and like from the mind and not worrying so much about like clicks or ad revenue and all that. So it kind of feels to me like the final chapter.
I'm sorry.
Oh no, yes.
Okay. Looking back, like now, what do you think was the key to you getting here today?
I think just like to keep doing it. There was a moment when like I sent out a bunch of clips to try and do freelance, and it was like I actually sent out physical clips, like photocopied them and mailed them, and I heard nothing back, and I was just like, oh man, damn. And then a friend of mine was saying, yeah, you did, that's because you sent it at the end of the year when no one's focused on hiring new writers. They're just kind of like working on their year-end coverage. Like try doing it in the spring. So like, all right. So I tried it in the spring, and then I heard back from people. And so I just kind of, I think just persistence. I think also, so a lot of times it's just luck. Like these moments happen. Like I remember I'd become friends with this writer, Lynn Tillman, and she knew this guy, Michael Miller. She thought we would like each other. In retrospect, she said she thought we would like each other because we were both tall, which seems like a very weird reasoning. But he was, he's now the editor of Book Forum, and like we both were into like music and books and stuff. And we had dinner one day, and I was talking about how I was really into Samuel Delany, and it was like the three of us, and then his friend Ed Park, who's the editor at the Village Voice, had just told him he needed someone to write a piece on Samuel Delany. So then he introduced me to Ed, and that's how I started writing for the Village Voice. So often it was like just these weird lucky moments where it's like I'd been in contact with him when I was in Buffalo. It didn't work, but I was on their map, like on their radar at that point. And then I did that piece, and like it was really well received. And then suddenly I was like doing that and writing for the music department for them at the same time, and doing more and more. And so a lot of those moments are just like luck. Like even with my job now, I was, in this point at Pitchfork where I was kind of like, yeah, I don't know if I want to keep doing this. Like they're going to move to One World Trade Center. I don't know if I really want to be working out of like a huge office tower. And I was just getting coffee at Homecoming Coffee, like 2 blocks from where we are now. Yeah. And Yancey, who's like, the co-founder of Kickstarter, came in to get coffee, and we've always known each other just from around the neighborhood. Like we weren't like super like friends or anything, but we were like friendly and like, hey, how are you doing? Like friendly with each other. And he was telling me this idea he had. He's like, yeah, I always wanted to kind of launch like a separate like kind of standalone site, just kind of help it come into existence, and like, but it wouldn't have to like, it would be its own entity. And this whole thing, he's like, can you think of someone who'd want to run that? And he really was legitimately just asking because he thought I was like in full at Pitchfork. And then I went back to my office and sat there for a while. Then I wrote him. I was like, I want to do this. And so they kind of became this thing where we went back and forth and figured it out. But it was, I often think like, what if I didn't get coffee that day? You know what I mean? Like then I could be in One World Trade Center right now. Like, oh God, what am I doing here? So I think a lot of it really is like persistence, but also just like some of it is just totally like the things kind of fall in the right direction. But I think also I think part of how I established my name like in the Pitchfork time is because I started going back to the music of my high school and like being really into heavy metal. And at that time, Pitchfork didn't really have metal coverage. Yeah. And I was like, yeah, we should like do metal. And so I came up with the idea for the column Show No Mercy. And when I first started doing that, all these metal guys were writing and just like, what are you doing? Like you're trying to like make metal popular, screw you. But it really was like, that was how I kind of established a voice on that site, where suddenly I sort of distinguished myself, not just as like another reviewer, but here's this guy who's like this authority on metal or something. And so I did that. So I think it's often just like finding a way that you can kind of stand out from the rest of that. And now Pitchfork has a bunch of metal writers, like regular metal writing. But at the time, it felt you were first, dude. I was first, man. But I mean, I'm friends with all those people. And that's the thing is like, also I think just being a nice person, maybe like when I left Pitchfork, I gave like a month notice. I made sure all my stuff was in order. Like, I left, we were all like, when I left, we were all sad and kind of like, but happy. Like it wasn't like I slammed the door. I was like, I'm out of here. Like it was very much like we all respect each other. Like we've done a lot of great things together, but this is just like, I'm ready to do something different. And this seems like the ideal thing for me to be doing right now. And so, it was like leaving in a positive way. Like my last day, like we kind of left and I had this like ongoing joke about the Bon Iver song Holocene, like how it's like such a sad song. And when I left the office, they actually like blasted that song. So it's like, so like I left on good terms. And so I'm still talking to those people. And I've even talked to Ryan, who started the site, like, maybe eventually I'll do a review if it's like the right review and stuff. So I think that's helpful too, like to kind of, if you're friends with someone and you work with them and you have a good camaraderie, there's no reason to be like, I'm leaving, so now you're horrible. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, I think people often can do that, like to like vilify the person they're leaving and like talk badly about them or whatever. And it's like, no, like my time at Pitchfork was great and we made a lot of good stuff there. It's just like suddenly it felt like not the thing I wanted to do, and not to like commute into like a huge tower and like suddenly have like oversight by a company that I wasn't 100% sure about. It's just like, all right, it's time to go. But it's like, doesn't reflect on the people there, So
I think sometimes people look at they judge it on the last 10% that didn't fit as opposed to the 90%.
Right. Yeah. It's often, I often try to tell my kids that we're like in the mornings when we're getting ready for school, they'll be great. And then like the last 5 minutes, they're horrible. Yeah. I'm always like, all I'm going to remember is that last 5 minutes. Yeah. I was like, but try to like just pull all the way, take it to the end. Like we don't have to like have the last moment where you decide that you hate the shirt you're wearing. You try on 37 different shirts and we end up being late. It's like, just finish it off to the end.
My grandmother always said, always leave while you're having fun.
It's good. That is a good, you don't want to overstay your welcome.
Yeah. I was curious, for someone who does, like, you work in music, art, writing, what else?
Music, art, writing. I guess that's it. Okay. Curate art stuff and collaborate with artists and write. Yeah, I think that's everything.
Okay. Do you see like a through line through everything or a commonality?
I think so. I recently I'm going to be on a panel next week in New Brunswick, New Jersey, about their sort of DIY music scene of the 90s, because I went to college at Rutgers in New Brunswick, so I lived there for some formative years of my life, and I realized they wanted me to bring something to this archive that they have now at Rutgers, like archiving the punk scene from that time, or like the music scene from that time, and I think just New Brunswick music in general. And they asked us each to bring something, like an archive that we had, a show and tell sort of thing. So I found some of my old zines I used to make, and I realized with the zines, this was before I mean, I still don't know how to lay things out on a computer. This was all cut and paste, and I realized, with a photocopier, and I had sort of a hookup, someone that I knew who worked at a university who I would pay very little amounts of money, and she would photocopy them during like off hours or whatever. And I realized with those, you're cutting and pasting it. It involves visual, spatial stuff, kind of laying things out. Kind of involves like a lot of things that I do now, but in like a very new, like amateur kind of form, like figuring it out. And so it did involve some kind of visual art sense, and like, all right, I need to, if I can't do this myself, I'll find an artist to collaborate with, or I'll write this stuff myself, and I'll also figure out the strategy of like, how do we get this out to people? And at that time, Tower Books still existed, and they would distribute zines. And so, just sort of, you learn this whole process of like almost how to run a small business in a way by just making these little zines and then, putting them out to the world. So I kind of realized with that there always has been this through line where a lot of this stuff has always connected for me in some way. When I was a teenager, I ran a record label, and in order to raise money to put records out, because at the time it was sort of pre-internet in a lot of ways. Like I was 17, so you had to make physical objects. And my friend Mark and I put on a 2-day music festival at my dad's house. My parents grew up in Brooklyn, and then when they were going to have kids, they moved to the country, like sort of like to get out of the New York of the 70s. And so my dad had this sort of a lot of space, and so we were like, let's fill this space with a festival. And so we had a hay truck was our stage. It was very, we were 17, so we kind of did the best we could. But with that, we raised money, put out. Started putting out CDs, but even that, just kind of coming up with a flyer, we found someone we knew who was a visual artist, and he made this like specific flyer for us, and we made T-shirts, and we kind of, so we merchandised it as best we could in that, that era. And then that kind of, we were able to put records out that way and sort of figure out distro. Then we started distributing my zine through the label and just stuff like that. Like, I think there's always been, early on, it was kind of this, because there weren't the ways to sort of distribute these things in other means, we kind of would just make our own stuff and make our own way of doing it. And, I played in bands, but I was never a great musician, I don't think. And that's why I kind of gravitated towards writing about it and thinking about it. But I think even now, this stuff definitely for me all connects. Like I just published a children's book with Simon & Schuster, and it's called Music Is. And so it's about music and about teaching children basically like ages, 8 months to 4 or 5 about music. And again, that connects with the other things I'm doing. And my editor at Simon & Schuster used to be the drummer in this old hardcore band Orchid. So I kind of knew him from around. And he approached me and said, "Hey, you're always writing stuff about your kids. Would you want to do a book?" And I think a lot of the things that I've been able to do have happened through that kind of stuff where you've just been doing it for so long. You sort of know people from doing things for so long, and then they know what your interests are. And it's always kind of, my stuff has always sort of fallen in the same zone. Like I think doing those zines when I was 13 or 14, it's very much what I do now still. It's just on a different scale. And now it's digital versus paper. And with the website we do now, the goal, which is called the Creative Independent, is to do a paper publication once a year, so we can kind of edit together our favorite interviews or the ones that seem like the most essential, and publish those on paper, so it doesn't exist only in the digital landscape. So I feel like in a way, like what I started doing then is what I'm doing now. And there were a lot of detours in between. Like there were definitely, there were years where I worked at the graveyard shift at a gas station in Western Canada, and when I worked in a greenhouse and didn't know anything about gardening, and just kind of all these different ways to kind of sustain a living, and then slowly was able to have the writing and the music stuff take up more of my time, and then until it eventually became my actual job. But it was definitely a long time coming. Like it wasn't like I went from making a zine to suddenly having a job. There were definitely years of just me doing all kinds of odds and ends to just kind of sustain the stuff that I wanted to do. And then it finally shifted. Yeah.
Did you have like a plan when you were doing those zines? Like I would like to go into writing or music.
Yeah, I think in a way that the zines made me a better writer and kind of taught me that I wanted to write. In a way, I started doing the zines because where we lived was this really small town, and there weren't a lot of people there were no people into what I was into. So I had a friend, this guy Moss, that I'm still friends with,
Okay.
who I knew from first grade. And we were both into like hardcore and punk and stuff. So we would go into Philadelphia because it was the one place we could get to via the speed line. And we would have like our parents drive us to the speed line and then get into there. And so we saw this world of zines and people being into the stuff we were into, and basement shows and like sort of backyard shows. So my zine was initially a way of just to communicate with other people. And so you'd get the zine out, you'd mail it to people, and they'd mail you their zines, and you'd write letters. And in retrospect, it's mind blowing that I actually sat around writing these like 5-page letters to people I didn't know. Like, hey, yeah, here's this stuff I'm into. Here's a record I like. We would trade cassette tapes and all that. So initially it was kind of like a social thing, like a way to kind of communicate with people outside of my small town. But as I was doing it, I realized that I liked doing it, and that I kind of had the ability to write, and that sort of fostered my thing. Like, all right, I want to be a writer, and I want to keep doing this. And there's something with writing for a zine that was easier for me than writing a paper for school or something, where I could just be really honest and just sort of, a lot of it I would try to write first drafts. I wouldn't edit. I would just kind of, here's, what I'm thinking. When I was in high school, I was really into like the, beat writers and stuff. So I was kind of thinking, I want to write this way where I'm just like being very honest and like not thinking too hard about it. It's funny, I've kind of come back to that style of writing, but now it's become, because I have 2 little kids, I have just a lot less time. And so my writing has become, again, very much like, not writing as fast as possible, but kind of, I definitely got to a period in my 20s where I sort of overthought things too much. And, I was really into like Thomas Pynchon and David Foster Wallace and all this stuff. And I was like, I'm going to write these crazy, like, postmodern sentences and that kind of thing. Like, had got really into James Joyce and all these people. And I think my shifting the way that I have, the amount of time I have now with, full-time job, all these side projects, kids, wife, everything. Now my writing's become very much the way it had been when I was a teenager.
Out of necessity.
Out of necessity. But now it's like for different reasons. But it's, I think in a way, that's my favorite way to write. It just took me a while to realize that.
Yeah. So it's not like, you don't have to worry so much about sentence by sentence being perfect.
Yeah, more like the overall idea. Like I think and I hope that now I know more than I did when I was 14. So I have more to think about. And with my new job, it's mostly interviews, but recently my friend Marcus at Bandcamp asked me to write about the new Bon Iver album for them. So I reviewed that. And I was just thinking that the way that I wrote that review was much different than I would have even just like 5 years ago before I had kids. And I just sat down, listened to it a few times, wrote my impressions out, and then sent him the review. And it was less like a labored kind of thing, where there's definitely a time period where you would think, let's like make these sentences as complex as possible. Let's like add this concept to it. And very much like the early days of Pitchfork when I was writing there, a lot of us did that. And a lot of us would have these sort of conceptual reviews where like, let's write this as if it's a monologue, or let's pretend this is like a presidential debate in the form of a review. And I think a lot of that stuff kind of fell away from that site too, as the people there, me included, kind of learned how to write better, and how we just kind of, not that we became professional necessarily, but just kind of once that site grew and was taken more seriously, it was kind of like, all right, we kind of owe it to the readers not to be total goofs, and just to kind of like not, instead of, there was a time where instead of posting a review, we'd post like a video as the review and things like that. So we kind of like, all right, let's move away from that and let's just try to write, and write, better writing. And also we just got better as editors, and we actually had editors in the early days of that site. I remember Ryan, who started the site, would call me and say, hey, would you want to review this thing for tomorrow? And he would like send it to me over email. I would listen to it, write the review, and then we'd post it that night. Like it was like very, very off the cuff. And then that shifted, and then it became like, all right, now we have fact checkers and we have like this and that. And I think that just changes the way you write. It also removes a lot of stress from the writer, because you actually have an editor. And I've always been into editors. I'm always happy to be edited. There's like definitely writers who don't want to be edited. Whereas for me, I'm like pretty unprecious about my stuff. And I always think a good editor makes you better. So I'm like, yeah, go for it. Edit my stuff.
Did you ever have a problem with letting stuff go when you write?
Not really. No, I've always been happy to sort of, especially because with the zines, I was just writing stuff out as quickly as I could and just kind of copying them and sending them out to the world. And then when I started writing before Pitchfork, I was freelancing for like the Village Voice and Time Out and stuff like that. And for those places, I was lucky to have really good editors. At the Village Voice, I had this editor, Ed Park, who is now, he left the Voice and he does an imprint now for, I think, Penguin, and he writes novels. And he was just a really great editor, where he would make my stuff sound better. So I was like, all right, cool. Like, feel free to edit. And then my music editor there, so when I wrote about books, Ed edited those. And then when I wrote about music, I had this editor, Chuck Eddy, and the same thing. Like, I liked his edits. And so I just kind of learned that it made sense to let someone else look at your stuff versus trying to fight it. And this guy, Michael Miller, edited me at a Time Out, and the same thing, where they would make suggestions. And you're like, yeah, it's a good point. And I think that's what good editors do. And I think my years at Pitchfork, I ended up being the person who was editing the other people. And just sort of, you kind of learn the tendencies of certain writers. You learn the things they do that maybe are their like weak spots, or you just wanted to kind of untangle their thoughts sometimes. And I think some of those writers were happy for you to do that. There's always the ones who don't want anything changed. And then you find the ones that don't want anything changed are the ones you want to assign less and less to, because it becomes more of a battle every time. And sometimes it is good to have someone who's just happy to be like, all right, and not that you want them to take every suggestion you make, but to have a dialogue back and forth. And it's the writers who treat their words as like holy writ or something, where it's a little bit complicated. And then you're just like, well, it actually would be better if when the process becomes a collaboration, I think is when it's the best. You don't want to just dictate the changes, but you want the person to be open to it and then go back and forth and explain why it works. So for me, I've enjoyed that process. I've had editors that are horrible too, and then you kind of resent those edits. And so there's the flip side to it, where for a while I was writing for like Playboy, the website, just reviewing like music for them. And they would always say, oh, this sentence is like too complicated. Let's like cut it down. And I'm all for that, but it became a thing where it was so pared down. They were like, this doesn't sound like me anymore. Or they would change words and say, yes, it's not a word. Let's change this word. Like, oh man. So there's definitely like moments like that where then the piece runs and it's not even recognizable as your own words, where I think that's bad editing.
So what do you think your writing has become as a result of the editing?
I think through the years doing it for so long, you hear different editors say, you have a tendency to do this, or it's in a weird way, it's almost like training. Like, if someone is like, when you run, you tend to like bend forward, you should stand back straight, or like that, those kind of things. So as a writer, you just kind of learn the things that you do and to look out for, and then you kind of work against those things. And it just, I think, makes you a stronger writer. Like I know I definitely had a tendency back in the day to kind of, because I was so into fiction and like that's what I went to school for, and went to grad school for literature and all this stuff, that I would be like, I want to fit everything that I know into this review. And like, that's just something that's a bad idea. Cause then before you know it, you're like talking about like Marxism when you're actually writing about like, a heavy metal album or something. It's just like makes no sense and it's just bad. And so I kind of learned to just focus on the music, and to also, I think editing other people, you see yourself on those writers too. And you're like, all right, this person has listed every song and described the music on every single track. And you're like, they probably don't need to do that. And they sort of kind of realize, oh yeah, I used to do that too. And so you sort of see yourself, especially in a lot of the younger writers. I'll see what I was doing, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And so it's easier to say, hey, this is something I used to do too. Maybe you should think about it this way. Maybe you should not do this. So I think just kind of that, you just learn the things that you do, that it's like find ways to work around it. And it just makes you think about things in a more specific way and like a clearer way. And, I think it's just like an ongoing process. I imagine the stuff, it's happened less so because I think now I'm comfortable with the way I write, but there's definitely, if I look at a review, sometimes I've written like 15 years ago, I'm just like, oh my God. Then if you go back further to like the stuff I was writing in college, when I was at Rutgers, I was the editor of the music section of the paper, but I was probably not fit to be an editor because I was a teenager essentially. But like it just happened that way because the guy who was the editor, who was a senior, was graduating, was just like, hey, you've written a couple reviews. Do you want to be the editor? I was like, yeah, sure. So I became the editor. And it was a time of like 90s indie rock. So I would write like really long explications of, Pavement records and stuff like that. And it was pretty bad writing, but it at least gave me the ability to gave me the opportunity to kind of like get my voice out there and start honing it. But so if I look back that far, then I'm so glad that stuff's not online. And then, 10 years ago, there's even things where I'm just like, oh man, I wish this wasn't online. But then more recently, it's gotten less like that. But I'm always curious, like what happens in 10 years? Do I look back now and go, oof, but I think as you get older, you kind of find your real voice, and it's maybe that shift is less drastic, but definitely in the teenage years, it's not as great. And I sort of am curious now that everyone does everything online. Like there's so much stuff unfolding online at all times. Like the teenagers now just have way more access to technology, and also their stuff is out there from an earlier time point, time. So it's sort of, they're going to have more to be embarrassed about, basically. And I think that's just like the way of growing. Yeah, it's just kind of a natural progression. And I just feel like I'm happy that I was able to do that outside of the digital realm, just so that there's less of a trail. Yeah. I mean, there still is a trail, but there's less of a trail. Yeah.
With TCI, what were your intention for the interviews? Like, what is it you like about interviewing? What are you looking for in an interview?
Sort of, I mean, with the creative independent, I sort of saw it as like an oral history almost. And like, what I wanted was to give the artists, it's music, books, film, dance, anything you could think of, really. Anything that's considered creative, which could really be anything. We're interviewing curators and teachers and all kinds of things. I basically just wanted those people to be first person. And one thing I've tried to do with some of the interviews, and it's worked, is I'll just edit myself out entirely. Okay. Like there's the first interview we ran was with Eileen Miles, a poet, and she said so many amazing things, and I realized I was basically just saying, oh, interesting, or whatever. So I was like, I'm just going to cut myself out and see if it works. And it worked. Like it sort of held together. And I did that with the interview we have up today with this young filmmaker, Zia Anger. Same thing. I just removed myself. We're doing one next week with this poet, Mira Gonzalez, and the same thing. I'm going to cut myself out of it. So my goal is really to have it about the creators and less about me doing the interview. Yeah. And so when I can, I'll do that. And I just wanted, other way to have it as a resource. So like one way that we're sort of tagging this stuff is, you can click through it on like writing or film or art. But then there's also like thematic kind of tags where it's like struggle, failure, success, inspiration, like sort of things like that. So people can kind of sort of click through and maybe find some like creative techniques for themselves that could be helpful in their own art making or whatever they're doing. So I saw it as that. Like I wanted it to be a resource versus just like a lot of content on the web now seems like it's really is just content. Like it kind of shows up. By the end of the day, it's disappeared under like 7 million other things. And then by the end of the week, you don't remember it. And there's also a lot of stuff that's like sponsored content where it's like clearly angling towards like some sponsor. Like here's like, these are the I remember there was an article once that was on Stereogum that was about like 10 ways these artists broke free and did home recording. And then you realize that the hashtag break free was actually like an ad for Virgin Airlines. And then we'll sort of like once the reader discovers that, you're just like, oh man, this is like kind of loses a lot. Yeah. So I think like, so sort of functioning in this zone where we don't have advertising and we can just sort of feature anyone we want. And we have just one person a day. It kind of allows that person, we've had someone like, we had Bjork, but then the next day we'll have someone much less known, or we'll have, Philip Glass. Then we'll also have, like Mira Gonzalez, a poet who's not super well known, but the day she's there, that's her whole day. And I think that's been something that's important to me, is that each person's treated the same and each person is there. That's all you have, is that one piece the entire day. And then we're also just trying to do a lot of sort of live events that kind of work with what we're doing on the site. So tomorrow on Thursday, we have a film premiere for the writer Dennis Cooper, who's living in Paris now. He made a film, and so we're going to show that. And we did like a talk with Ian Mackay early on. We're doing a talk with Laurie Anderson. We did a collaboration with Housing Works where we had some different writers like Michael Denzel Smith and Dorothy Lasky, but then also musicians. So we had like Waxahachie played, and we had an artist, Adam J. Kurtz, made art. So it's sort of like sort of like overlapping all the things that we're into in the live zone as well. It was just for me a huge way of just slowing down the internet and giving people time to just like focus on one thing and not like editing them to a degree, but in fact, editing them, some of them a lot, but kind of keeping them fairly long so that you actually can dig in and get something out of it. So it doesn't become a soundbite. But ultimately, we want it to be a resource, and we're going to do like different versions of the site as we go along and kind of make it more and more usable, where people really can just click on like a concept, like, hey, I want to learn about collaboration. Then you get like every quote about that. So that kind of thing. So I think eventually we'll have it there. And right now, because it's still so new and we've only have 3.5 weeks of interviews, we don't like, once we build up a huge archive, then we'll start rolling that out in different ways. But it really is ultimately sort of a resource for creative people to use and to kind of get inspired to be like, all right, I can, like, I was, right when you came today, I was editing this interview with this artist, Chantel Martin. And in that, she talks about how she sees writing and drawing as the same thing, and just kind of explain some techniques she has for if she has creative block, like how she gets through it, and how if you look at her drawings and you see a circle, it's usually when she's like spiraling and trying to think of something, and it's just kind of these kind of things I think will be helpful for people. This other artist, Cynthia Dagneau, we interviewed, talked about how she tried to do one painting a day, because that way you never put too much stress on one particular painting, because you're doing so many, you never think this needs to be perfect. And so for her, that was a way to kind of work through creative blocks and kind of create these things. So I think that's really what we want, is people to find some kind of, truth in this stuff. And also, we had this piece with Anoni, the singer, that's really kind of gone viral, as they would say, like it's really gotten around. And it's because she was like very just blunt about like, I did this video with Apple. They basically got a free advertisement out of it, and it was not a good situation. So she's sort of being really honest. And I think that has resonated with a lot of people. And the other big one we did that really got out there was with Philip Glass about music streaming, and the same idea of like not getting paid for your work. And so seeing like the ones that have resonated with people, I realize people mostly are in tune and feeling strong opinions about like music industry and money, and a lot of people just not getting paid. And so you sort of realize with the Anoni one, a lot of artists were retweeting that. Like I saw, Zola Jesus and like How to Dress Well, and other musicians just like, like this has happened to me too. This is something. So you kind of realize people do want to know these things, and they want someone to be honest and be like, I did this thing for Apple. I'm complicit in this as well, but it ultimately wasn't a good experience for me because I put all my heart into this video. Then at the end, it has like an Apple logo, and it becomes an ad. And it's,
but then I have to wonder, like, okay, you do that. It's not like Apple's a new company.
Exactly. Yeah. There's a certain level of like, you should know what you're getting into. Yeah. Which I think is, why I think it was interesting that she was willing to talk about it. Cause it's also like easy to be like, come on, you knew what you were getting into, but I think, I think in a way it also pointed to the fact that labels just don't have the money to make things now. So you have to find other ways to get the stuff you want to do. And that video, if you think about it, it was pretty, like Naomi Campbell's in it, and it's like there's some dancers in it, but it's like pretty basic in some ways. Like, so part of you thinks, well, maybe there could have been a way to make it for like less money than you would have made at Apple. But I think in a lot of times it's hard to think in those terms. Like I had this grand vision I want to make, and so you have to find a sponsor or whatever.
Who can get it out there?
Yeah, who can distribute it? Exactly. Yeah, especially if people aren't buying music as much. Like the videos become important to sort of, spread your word, so then you can sell tickets for your live shows, which I think seems to be the way people are making money. But really is like festivals and stuff at this point.
So for your interviewing style, like for something like for her interview, are you thinking about to push back and like, well, why do it, or just to sort of let the artist?
It depends on the interview.
Talk about.
It depends on the interview. I've interviewed Anoni before, and usually with her, like that interview, my intention was to talk about her visual art, and like it very quickly went to a different area. And so we started out by me just being like, so you do visual art too, and you have a gallery show up right now, or a museum show. And then she talked about that, and I go, is this sort of a break from music? And then she just sort of went into the music thing. So I honestly sat there for about 20 minutes just kind of listening to her, because it was amazing. And then it suddenly became about like politics and other things, and it just sort of shifted into a whole different zone and corporations and stuff. So all right, I'm going to just like listen to this. It's kind of the same way if I was interviewing Kanye West, I probably would do the same thing where in a way they're very similar thinkers. Like once they start going on something, you're like, all right, I'm going to step out of the way and let this happen. But I think with other people, definitely, you'll push back and say, well, why did you do that? Or what happens if you did something here and it wasn't successful? Or, do you regret doing this? Or, why would you do this? And also, you definitely want to question. With her, it was because it was such a surprising territory. I kind of wanted to just sit back and see where it would go and like let her say her piece. So that was sort of a different scenario.
And with the long format interview, it gives you that option because you don't know where it's necessarily going to go.
Right. Yeah. And in some too, there's always things you edit out. Like I've definitely, with each interview I've done, we're trying to focus this stuff at least on one general topic. So, for instance, one thing that Anoni talked about that I ended up editing out was just a huge section about like Donald Trump and all this stuff. And I was just thinking like, in 5 years, I'm hoping people don't really remember Donald Trump or care much about it. So it's kind of like, I want to edit this out because I don't need this to be in. Like, there's certain things that seem too topical to like the moment. And so like, there's definitely been time, or I interviewed this guy, Vernon Chapman, who's one of the writers for South Park. That interview hasn't run yet, but there's a large part where he talks about Trump too. And the same thing where I just feel like when I do edit that, I'm just going to remove that stuff because it just feels like in 5 years, I want it to be more about him talking about the creative process of writing these episodes versus like him going off on Donald Trump.
To have it be more evergreen and that people can keep coming back, especially when your focus is more about the process of art.
Right.
And that type of thing.
Yeah, like that's what we always say is we want them to be evergreen. And it's been interesting. Like, I've been having music publicists hit me up and they're like, hey, when is that interview running? And I keep saying, it's going to run, don't worry. And we just like, we try to adjust things according to like what is going on in the world. So if something seems relevant, like, hey, let's put this interview about this. Okay. Like, around election week, all the interviews we have kind of deal with politics in some way or another, not in like a really like nail on the head kind of way, but, in ways where people are bringing up issues that have been part of the campaigns and part of like what are in people's minds. So I keep telling them, these publicists, hey, don't worry, it's going to happen. Yeah. And then they're having a hard time believing that. They're like, well, this sounds to me like you're just going to shelve it. I'm like, no, we're not going to shelve it. We're not operating on release cycles or like album cycles. And when we do interview a band, it's not like I'm asking them about that record anyway. We're asking about something else. So it's sort of like we're trying not to focus the interviews on like one specific project. Like if I interview Barry Jenkins for Moonlight, I don't want to talk specifically about that. I would maybe talk about getting your vision made without interruption, like things like that, where it becomes a larger topic versus like that performance and that one scene. Like I don't want to be too specific because then, in 5 years, it's like it's so narrow. So it's something that becomes more of a resource.
Was that something? I'm sorry.
Oh no, sorry. Go.
Was that something you felt missing in interviews or when you would read interviews?
Yeah, I felt like a lot of interviews
too focus on a cycle.
Yeah, I think a lot of interviews I would see just felt kind of like just sort of part of the PR campaign kind of thing. And like one that I saw, something I thought of recently was there was an artist who came out with a record and I interviewed her. And then like the day after I interviewed her, like I saw an interview go up. Then I was like, oh, cool. Then a couple days later, another interview go up. I was like, And then like another interview. Then before you know it, there was like 7 interviews. I was like, all right, we're going to hold this for like 5 months. And like the thing that I interviewed her about was not about the record, but still it just felt like there were so many other interviews. Yeah. And a lot of them were the same. Like it's the same talking points. And I know, I'm friends with Bjork and like I've known her for a long time. And one time she was saying like, often the first interview for her during a press cycle is like she says everything she wants to say. It could almost be that's the interview. Yeah. But the way the thing works is you keep giving interviews. And so she'll drink a lot of coffee, do the one interview. First one, she's like, all right, I said everything I want to say. Then every interview after that, in a way, becomes like just another version of that first interview because it's hard to say new things for each person. I mean, if you think about
20 interviews.
Yeah, if you're doing 20 interviews a day, you're going to start repeating stuff. Yeah. It's just like, it's impossible not to. And so I think that's what we wanted to step outside of. I interviewed Matt Berninger from that band, The National. That hasn't run yet, but he hadn't done an interview in months. So he was like, wow, this is great. I haven't like talked to anyone about this stuff in a long time. So it became, and we talked about a different kind of topic, but he was relaxed and it was the only interview we had all day. And you can imagine if you're sitting down with someone, you don't even know where they're coming from. You're like, hey, this is the 10th interview I've done today. And it's just like, so we want to step outside of that as much as we can. And so in many ways, when a publicist reaches out and is like, hey, you want to meet with this person? They have this time here. They're next week doing interviews. I'm usually like, no, like we'll like wait, like let's do something later on because right now it seems like what's the point? Especially if we're running one interview a day, we want that one interview to feel special. You don't want it to be, it's our one interview a day. Then some other site has that interview plus like 75 other things, So
all
like
within a 2-week period.
So that's one thing we're trying to do really is escape that. Cause I did feel like that where a lot of stuff you would read just felt like it was part of like feeding this overall PR campaign and not like useful in like a larger or like long-term kind of situation. Yeah.
Well, you're seeing that with podcasts now. There's what's it? Ariana Huffington. She had a book on sleep and she was on every single podcast. And it was like, she's pretty much saying the same thing.
Right.
Like, what does she have to say different? Because she's in this cycle promoting her book.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting. It almost is like people are trying to cover as many, there's that whole thing that people always write like, in case you missed it. Like, and I feel like that kind of approach is like, there is so much going on. People are bound to miss something. So like the in case you missed it thing actually can be helpful because you're like, oh yeah, I actually did miss that. But I think that sort of approach is like, let's just like bombard people And one thing I've tried to say to publicists is like, hey, think about it. Everything will be died down. Then this thing will run. It'll remind people of the record, which is actually like a good technique. And they're like, nah. So, all right. So it's like, it's a different thing of just like where they want to like blitz as many as people as possible, which to me, like it's a curious approach because people aren't really buying music anymore. And it's ultimately like I would feel like you'd want stuff closer to a festival season anyway. So your band could get booked. So you have like one more clip to send to like to the booking agent. Like, hey, look at this thing just ran. You know, it's this album's still relevant.
So is this they're still running under the culture of first week sales? And you got to hit everything.
It seems very much like
that. You high.
Yeah. Although now it seems like to get onto Billboard, if you sell like 37 records,
you top 10.
Top 10. Yeah.
That would have been like the bottom of the 200.
Yeah, I know. Back in the day, it would have been like no. I remember there was that whole thing where what's his name? I'm not forgetting his name now. The son of the Growing Pains guy.
Okay, Thick.
Alan Thicke. Yeah, Rob Thicke.
Robin Thicke?
Robin Thicke. Like when he released that record and he literally sold like 7 copies. Do you remember? And they were like, yeah, his sales in the UK this week, it was like 7. I was like, no, really? And it really was. That's insane. And I think it was because he had people were sick of him and the album was kind of a weird, mean-spirited thing about his like wife or whatever. So I think that was part of it. But the fact that like it was literally 7 copies or whatever, it's like, that's insane.
That many people didn't care.
So I worked in a record store in college and we would have the thing where this was like during the grunge era.
Yeah.
And, they put the Pearl Jam record on sale like at midnight the night it was able to be sold. And there'd be like a line of like 100 people out there. And
I remember
by the end of the night, it would be sold out. We're like, sorry, sold out. Like before the last person even got in. So yeah, it's just like, wow, that was one tiny record store in New Jersey. And now like over an entire country, it's like 7 copies. Yeah. So wow.
Do you feel like that's what makes, well, I guess it does make what you're doing different than not having to worry about the cycles. Does that like somehow affect with how you get interviews with people?
So far it's been, we've had a lot of good luck so far. Like, it's been, some areas have been hard. Like we were talking before we were recording that, film has been harder sometimes, I think, because a lot of times filmmakers maybe do fewer interviews and are kind of holding out and waiting for like something specific. But yeah, otherwise it's been, people have been excited to do them and a lot of people have then recommended someone else. Like the way that I got in touch with Vernon Chapman, the South Park writer, was because Matt from The National was like, oh, I think someone I know who'd be really good for this is Vernon Chapman. I live in LA now and I met this guy. Let me loop you in. So then he looped us in, and this guy, Charlie Reff, who works at Sundance, has like put us in touch with a lot of people. So I think people like the idea and they sort of, it's been a word of mouth thing in many cases. Like people will just reach out and say, hey, I want to do this. Like even with the Anoni one, that was something where her manager, Sean, was like, yeah, Noni really wants to do one of these interviews. I was like, oh, cool. So then it was like, when we ran that interview, it was something that a lot of her publicity team didn't even know was happening because it was basically like the manager said Anoni wants to do it. One day I got an email from Anoni, then like we got on the phone and talked. So it's just like, I think some people, that's been like the great scenario where people have a lot to say and they just want to, same thing with Philip Glass. That was like through his manager, and I don't think much of like any of his team knew it was happening either. And so when you're working off that cycle, people, if they want to do it, they'll find their way to you, which has been cool. And then other times when we reach out, now that we actually have the site launched, we can show people what it looks like. You know, because we've done a ton of interviews and we have a bunch still that we haven't run yet. But before we had the site going, sometimes it's hard to reach out to someone and say, hey, you want to do an interview for this thing doesn't exist. Yeah. So, but now that it does exist and people have had like a strong response to it, it's been easier to do for sure. Because we can reach out to people we've never had any contact with. Okay. Early on, it was easier to kind of rely on people who knew either Mai or Cole or Laurel, our creative directors, or Charlotte, who's doing our like social media stuff. If they knew us in some way, like, all right, these people are like, not flakes. They really will launch this. So it was people that had worked with us in some way before where you could say, hey, I remember I interviewed you for this. Would you want to do that? And so now we can just totally like cold contact people. And that's made it easier for sure. Yeah. Just sort of, actually having something to show them.
How do you prepare for your interviews?
Kind of depends on the person. I've been running into a thing recently, which has been fun, which has been good for me, where I'm interviewing like authors, and so I have to read their books. Okay. And because I read a lot for many, many, many years, and having 2 kids, suddenly I was like finding less time to read. So lately, like I'm interviewing Jace, DJ Rupture about his book on Monday. So I'm like, all right, and I'm finishing that, and then I'm there's this novelist, Britt Bennett. So I'm finishing her book now. So it's just kind of, that's been a kind of preparation that I haven't been used to for years, because I usually would just like listen to the record. All right, I got questions.
Yeah.
So or going to a show, like an art show, just sort of seeing what the exhibition looks like. So the preparation depends. Sometimes I'll just kind of have a question in mind that I want to talk about. And so it won't take much preparation at all.
Okay.
And often like I'll just come with kind of one question and sort of see where that goes and kind of go from there. And then other times, like when I interviewed Ian MacKay from like Fugazi and Discord Records and stuff, he's like so specific and such like a, not that he's like kind of a tough guy in a sense. Like he has like strong opinions and strong thoughts that that was one where I really was like, all right, I need to like prepare for this, because he's not one to like suffer fools in a way. So I was like, I don't want to like go up there unprepared and have him just be like, no. So like that one was one that I really worked on. And plus he's also someone that when I was 12 and 13 was a hero to me. So it's kind of that one you feel like slightly intimidated by. But in most cases I'll have, like when I interviewed Philip Glass, I basically was like, hey, I heard that you're thinking about putting a lot of the stuff, he runs his own label online. What are your thoughts on streaming? And he just kind of went on and just talked. So I just, all right, cool. Just kind of sat there. So I think I'll try to find something that seems like something that the person is interested in. When I interviewed Eileen Miles, the poet, I was like, I noticed your Instagram you use Instagram in an interesting way. Like she'll take 10 photos of the same thing. And I was like, well, how do you view your use of Instagram? And then she kind of went on about how it's for her like a writing technique and all this stuff. So yeah, I'll try to like find something that seems like something they could talk about. But so it really depends person by person. And sometimes like the thing you'll go in to talk about just doesn't work. Like I had this question about an artist who does like durational work. And I said, yeah, I see you have a child now, and I know from my own situation that your sleep changes. And also like, are you still interested in these like long durational works? And he was just like, yeah, it hasn't affected me at all. I was like, all right. So
now where do I go?
I quickly came up with something else, and it worked. Like it ended up being a good interview, but it was definitely like, I thought this will be a clever way. And then like, all right, this failed. Yeah. So yeah, there's definitely those moments too, where the person just, the thing you think they're going to have a lot to say about, they're just like, don't have anything to say about.
Did you know this about yourself, that you could just go in with one question? Because that's sort of what I do.
Right.
Like it's just one question and see what happens. Did you know that about yourself? Or?
Not really. I kind of learned that with this. And I think part of it was because I'm just doing way more interviews now than I used to. Like when I was at Pitchfork, I would do interviews, but it was like, I would do 2 a month or something, or like, or like 1 a month, or there was that section called Rising where it's like a new up and coming artist. So for those, I'd often have a lot of questions, because when it is like an up and coming person, often they're not that comfortable talking about their work yet. Yeah. So you kind of need to be able to prod them along, like, oh, I really like, or sometimes it would be people I didn't know a huge amount about, because someone would say, hey, this sounds like something you would be into. Would you want to interview them? And I'd say, yeah, sure. Whereas, one of the last interviews I did for Pitchfork was Diamanda Galas. And for her, I knew a lot about her, and it was one of those interviews like the 5, 10, 15, 20s where you talk about what music did you like when you were 5, 10, 15, 20. So that was, I didn't prepare for that at all, because I just kind of went in and was like, what did you like when you were 5? And she would just kind of go on. And but in most cases, I would just have a lot of questions. But then with this, because when we first started putting the site together, I was sometimes doing like 6 interviews a week just to kind of create a backlog that when we launched, we didn't run out of stuff to do. And so just out of necessity, I started thinking, I'll just come up with like one thing. And then this keeps the interview focused, because the interviews we're trying to run, we are trying to keep them fairly focused. So we don't want it to be like too wide ranging anyway. So I was like, I'll just come up with a topic and then just kind of go from there. And then usually in most cases it works. And sometimes, I think it's worked every time, in the sense that by the end we've come up with something. But there's definitely been ones where you go in, like I was saying, the thing you think is going to work doesn't, then you kind of have to like come up with something else. But it's really just, I like the way you were framing this is like you want to have a conversation. So I've been kind of viewing them in that way too, where it's more of a conversation and less like me being like, all right, in 1962, you were at the Art Institute of Chicago. Like it's like less like that. It's more just like, let's talk about like technique or process or and I think in that way it works, because it is, and also because it's less about pitching a record or something. I don't need to know all the details. Like I don't need to be like, so this was produced by Flood. What was that like? It's more like, all right, so what is your technique for doing this, or why have you always approached your music in this particular way, or something like that? Yeah,
because you can kind of do what you want.
Yeah,
because I heard 2 albums this year, and I interviewed the people. And at first, I was like, "Well, their albums came out last year, right?"
Right. Yeah.
I can't have them. I'm like, "Well, no, yes, I can."
Yeah, totally.
Like, what difference does it make?
Yeah.
If someone hasn't heard of their music or art, this is new,
right?
And it's a total way to get into their art.
Yeah, and often too, it's good to talk to them when they're outside of that zone, because they have fresh perspective on it. They have more to say. There's definitely people that I would try to interview now, even in the album cycle. Like I wanted to interview Frank Ocean, for instance.
Okay.
Of course, like had no way to contact him. I like even hit up my old friends at Pitchfork. Was like, hey, do you guys have a contact? They're like, yeah, I wish we did. It's just like, but
has he done any?
No. Yeah. So I was hoping, I was like, maybe he would like do some like small interview site. You know, he seems like one of those people, like a Sufjan Stevens or something, who will just like randomly be like, yeah, sure, I'll do that. Why not? You know, part of me holds out hope that Kanye is the same way, because I feel like he is someone who, if I could just sort of get through to him, he'd be like, hey, this is a website that features like visual artists and dancers and stuff. And that's like his world, I think, that he wants to be seen as, not just like a pop guy. So he's another person. You're not going to
deal with him in the same way that, you know, Entertainment Weekly or
right, exactly. Yeah. If I were just to like say, hey, let's talk about your like your fashion, or let's talk about your, you know, your creative direction or something. That's what I would want to talk to him about versus like his records.
Yeah.
Because I mean, I think his records are good, obviously, but I think that the interesting thing about him is that he brings like he even if, you know, he people like love or hate him, and like I hear so many people like, oh, I hate Kanye or something. I'm like, but he brings such like an interesting, like difficult aesthetic to pop culture that I appreciate. Like even just having like, he made that zine and had the release party in like a parking garage with like graffiti art and stuff. I'm like, he went for it, you know, even if you don't agree with it and you think like, oh, this guy's annoying, it's like he's trying stuff, and I appreciate that. So I think that's what I kind of want to talk about, is like figuring out that side of what he's up to, and like his interest in visual art and all that. It's funny, like I'm friends with Matthew Barney. He had a film launch at BAM, and like Kanye has said, like, yeah, Matthew Barney is like my savior or whatever, or like my favorite living artist. And Matthew and I both have beards, and at the time my beard was bigger and like Matthew's was, and I was standing there talking to my friend, and suddenly I looked over and Kanye was standing right there. And it's one of those things where you're so used to seeing someone all the time, and I was just like, hey, like kind of like very casually, and he's like, oh, sorry, and he realized that I wasn't. Matthew kind of walked on.
Wrong bearded guy.
But I guess that was the night that he approached Matthew and was just like, yeah, you're my favorite living artist, and all this stuff. And it's like a 6-hour movie, and he was there for like a large part of it.
Really?
Like he definitely was into it. I think there's a point, I don't know, there's a point when he did leave, but I was still like, he definitely isn't just into it in a surface way. Like if he's going to sit through like many hours of this really slow moving movie, he definitely does enjoy it. You know, so yeah, I think that's interesting to have like a pop star, like an icon of that sort, like show up at this thing and just be like, I'm actually going to be here to watch it. Like I'm not just going to walk in and be seen and duck back out. You know,
to get something from it that he's able to learn.
Yeah, so I think that's interesting. So he's definitely on my like creative independent wish list.
So what do you plan next for? So the printed version's coming out this year? Will that be
our plan is like, because we've been up for like a month. Yeah. So our plan is like at the end of the year to kind of put together some kind of book. And we've been asked to like collaborate with some like festival stuff. You know, some stuff we've turned down where the festival seems to not be like our aesthetic. Other stuff has been. So we're like, helping out with those things. I was just helping Ballroom Marfa figure out some things for an event they're doing. So we're trying to find like-minded collaborators to do projects with, and you know, visual artists. That things that I do outside of work will still exist. Like the things that I do where, you know, I did like an art piece out in Wyoming not too long ago. It was like me and Matthew Barney and Matthew Day Jackson and Angel Deridorian from like, you know, he used to be in Dirty Projectors, did a vocal part, and this woman, Dana Walks, oversaw like the musical aspect, and George from the band Deaf Heaven. So kind of this like big collaborative art project. So I'll still do those things that are just my own random things that I do. Simon & Schuster asked me to do a second kids book. So I'm doing like a second kids book, which is fun. Doing a children's book is fun in general. We had a book launch at Word Books in Greenpoint last weekend, and we framed it as book launch / children's dance party. So we had like an open juice bar and everything. And my friend Dave, who owns that bar, St. Vitus, came and DJ'd, and he kind of basically chose tracks that matched up with the things I was trying to describe in the book. So it's like, music is quiet, music is loud. And so he chose different songs. Yeah, that was really fun. So like, doing all that kind of stuff. And for the site itself, it's just like to continue doing these interviews, and on the weekends we do like an audio piece of some sort, continuing to do those, maybe expanding that into something else offline at some point, like maybe collecting all those and having something in a gallery or whatever. And yeah, I think we've just been trying to, it's a very small team. It's like me, Laurel, who's our creative director, Cole, who's the senior editor, Charlotte, and then our intern Hannah. And we're just like trying to find ways to kind of keep keep expanding the site, but sticking to our vision, you know, and like not succumbing to like easy grab. You know, like, you know, we were offered something at one point, like, hey, you want this exclusive thing? And it would have been amazing, but it was like, but, you know, then in the credit, you have to post that it was, you know, credit of Red Bull or something. I was like, nah, that kind of doesn't go with the aesthetic of the site, you know, so it's like appreciated, but those kind of things we're just trying to be really careful about. Because I feel like once you ruin the brand, it's kind of ruined. Like I feel that way about Ken Bone in a way. Like, you know, like he was, after the last presidential debate, everyone's like, yeah, Ken Bone, this guy's awesome. And then within 3 days, he's like pitching stuff for Uber and like kind of like all these, I was like, man, dude, I understand like you want to make money, but it's like, what a way to like implode your brand within like 4 days. You know? I was joking to someone, like, they should put him in touch with Ian MacKay, who's like managed to like exist for 35 years without doing that. And this guy took 4 days. But so I think like that kind of thing where we just want to like, because I feel like once you make that wrong move, it's hard to like regain trust. So we just want to keep the site very specific. And I mean, we're lucky in that, you know, Yancey and Perry from Kickstarter kind of asked me to do this and approached me, and we had like long discussions and like figured it out, how the vision of the site. And at this point, it's just like, hey, make this thing, and like the freedom to do it is like a very lucky position to be in.
Had you been holding I Did for a while?
Yeah, it's basically like I was at Pitchfork and I was like just there doing my thing, and I ran into Yancey in the coffee shop up the street at Homecoming Coffee, and he was like, you know, I've always wanted, you know, thinking it would be cool to like have like an editorial site. And then he kind of gave me like a rough idea. I was like, huh. And he said, who do you think would want to do that? Because he didn't think that I had any interest in like leaving where I was. And then like later that day, I wrote him. I was like, you know, I would be interested in doing that, because it just seemed like such a interesting concept. And then we went back and forth and kind of honed in on what it would be exactly. So there was like an overall concept, and it really like what it is now is not what it initially was, but it was like generally like it was generally like, let's make something that helps creative people, and like but there was many more aspects that kind of got removed in order to hone in on one specific idea. So yeah, it was really just like chiseling away until it became what it is. But it was definitely a collaborative thing with me, him, and Perry, kind of all like really honing in on what exactly they would look like. And then Laurel, the creative director, she's the one who made it look as it looks. Like there had been some idea for a different style and stuff, and she was like, no, I want to start from scratch. And so she started from scratch and made something totally different. So yeah, it really became this full-on collaborative
it's very
project.
Clean, the website.
Keeping it, that's what we wanted to keep it, in her words, like keep it kind of quiet, relaxing. I know like when I'm looking at like analytics and stuff, I'll see there's people just sitting on the homepage, and I feel like they're just watching the snail. You know, and I think there like some people, I've had a few people tell me they've made it their homepage. So when they go on their computer, they're just like, like almost like meditating to it, which is nice, because you figure there's a lot of sites where you click on it and then like a pop-up ad comes up, and then you're like, where's that sound coming from? Like there's all these like kind of things. So yeah, just keeping it so you're actually in control of the site. Like the site's not controlling you as the reader, you know, like kind of, you can just move around however you want, and it's one thing a day. And whatever.
And then like how you have to, the one interview's there, but then you have to go to the archive to
scroll through the rest.
Busy.
Yeah, they kind of keep like each week we'll add. So by the end of the week there'll be 5, and then they kind of move to the archive the next week, so it keeps like 1, 1, 1, and it goes to the archive. But yeah, it's been fun, and I think, but it was something that I like. It's not like I was like out like shopping around a concept. It really was like running into someone at a local coffee shop, and then just kind of. But again, I think this goes back to that whole idea of like being around doing the same kind of stuff for a long time, and knowing people just from around. Like I knew Yancey as like a friend, but not like a close friend necessarily, just someone that I knew, and we'd stop and talk. Hey, how are you? And we'd like get lunch now and then. So yeah, it's just these like weird chance moments, because you just sort of orbited the same zone for a long time. So I think
you have your reputation. So
I think so. It's like it wasn't like not like a conscious like, here's my plan, I'm gonna like start making zines and one day have my site. Like it's just kind of, and like honestly, the way that where I grew up, and like growing up in like a pretty like working class family, I never thought I would actually do what I'm doing. Like my idea was like, all right, I work at Cumberland Farms and I do my stuff on the side, or like I work in this weird falling apart movie theater. Like I always just had jobs. Like when we interviewed Philip Glass, he's like, I was working from when I was 15, and he was still driving a taxi when he was 42. And at that same kind of thing was what I thought. You know, I worked on a farm picking blueberries when I was like 13, and then all through high school I had jobs, college had jobs, and grad school I had jobs. And it's sort of like, all right, I'm always going to do jobs and do my stuff on the side. And I think in a way that's helped me, because now that my job is what I was doing on the side, I have like an intensity of like focus where I can just kind of like, all right, I'm gonna get as much done as possible. And, it's just in the side projects all kind of fit into the job itself now. Yeah. Where it used to be like, leave, the gas station, then go home and be like, I'm going to try to do this thing. But I will say, working the graveyard shift at a gas station, there's definitely like a 2-hour lull where I would just sit there and read. So there's like a certain point where people just don't come in, Yeah. So here I am from like, 2:30 a.m. to like 4:30. Just reading. And just reading. Then by like 5, people like the early birds start coming in and stuff. Yeah. But so I think that all that stuff, it was, I just always assumed I would just do this stuff on the side. You never really think it's, it'll be my job. But thankfully it has been. Thank God.
So the website for
it says creativeindependent.com.
Yeah, if people want to check out your stuff, other writing.
You can also, I tend to like tweet a lot.
Okay.
So you can check like it's just my name, like at Brandon Stosuy. So at BrandonStosuy. And I generally like post links there because I don't really have like an actual site. Okay. I just use social media.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you, Brandon.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Sure.
Thank you.
And there you have it, a double conversation from Brandon Stosuy. I hope you enjoyed both of them. Make sure you check out the website, thecreativeindependent.com, and follow Brandon on Twitter at Brandon Stosuy, BrandonStosuy. I am online several places, several ways, talkmusictalk.com for more information on this very podcast. Check out my books and music at thisisvoice.com because I write and I make music. And follow me on Twitter or Instagram at thisisvoice. And don't forget the call to action. Please share this episode on social media if you enjoyed it. Make sure you take the survey at talkmusictalk.com/survey and download the app. It is free for iPhone and Android, wherever you get your apps. Or you can subscribe on iTunes or Google Play. Make sure you leave a rating and or review in the store. And when I say review, it can be something as simple as, I enjoyed it. That's it. It does not have to be complex or long. And I have some back catalog suggestions once you subscribe. Episode 100, I interviewed Carlos D., formerly of Interpol. He talks about why he left the band for the very first time in full detail. Episode 101, I talked to Donnie McCaslin. He's the saxophonist whose band played on Bowie's last album, Black Star. I also talked to J. Edward Keys on episode 106. He is the editorial director of Bandcamp Daily. And 2 LCD sound system focus episodes, 107 and 108. 107 features Ryan Leese, who wrote an entire book on the sound of silver, and episode 108 with Gavin Russum, who plays synths and LCD sound system. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Till next time, and there will be a next time, this one's for you, Liz.